Now, I've only lived on this earth for 40 years, so there is still much that I don't understand or know. But if you told me about someone who found out that they lived in a fire trap and then when they asked for help to escape it, were told that they must pay for the privilege, I'd assume it was a new instalment in the Saw movie franchise or some cruel twist on the hostage movie genre, and at some point, Liam Neeson might threaten someone in a way that makes it sound like he really, really needs a lozenge. Obviously, though, I haven't got a clue about reality, as according to the government, this is just the standard way to treat millions of people who currently live in buildings with unsafe cladding or a number of other worrying safety issues. I suppose, if you look at it objectively, maybe it's someone's own fault for choosing to live somewhere they had no idea was a veritable death trap because shoddy contractors were given vast amounts of money by public institutions to throw together buildings quickly and pocket the profit. I mean, who else's fault would it be? The contractors who did it? The government whose years of cuts and destruction of safety regulations have caused this? No, don't be silly. It's the residents' fault for wanting to live a normal life and not die unnecessarily, which is a sort of selfish intention that some people just insist on having in today's day and age. What are they like? A couple of weeks ago, Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick announced new plans to end the cladding scandal in, as Jenrick said, a way that is fair and generous. He didn't say fair to who, though, and it appears it was mostly generous to developers, contractors and no one else, and it's probably only fair in the way that at a coconut shy, it will cost you a lot of money to not get any prizes. Not enough money was pledged to make buildings safe, not every building qualifies for the plans, and leaseholders are still going to be subject to a number of charges because they have the audacity to want to live in their homes and be safe. It's once again another example where the government have seen a gaping wound, heard the cries for help, and decided all they can be bothered to manage is to put a small finger plaster on it and then blame the victim for still being stubborn enough to bleed out and die, despite everything that they've done for them. The Conservatives are meant to be the party of home ownership, but maybe that's just because the Housing Secretary owns several himself and isn't remotely bothered about any others. This week I spoke to Natasha, Letchford and Giles Grover at the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, who are calling on the government to lead a national effort to end the cladding and safety crisis. It's been quite a busy week for them at the campaign, with the McPartland-Smith amendment to the Fire Safety Bill going to Parliament this week on Wednesday, so it may have happened by the time you've heard this. And that's where two Conservative MPs have tabled the proposal that no costs of remedial work on the buildings necessary as part of the Act are passed on to the leaseholders or tenants. And if that goes through, as I said, it may have happened by now, it'll make a very, very big difference to those currently hit by large costs on top of all their safety worries too. So I asked Natasha and Giles all about the scandal and how people are affected, why Jenrick's recent announcement was so useless, and just what can be done to help. Hi Giles and Natasha, thank you for speaking with me this week. I know you've got a very, very busy week ahead of you. I suppose the first question I feel I should ask you is that it's been, and this might sound a bit naive, I guess, but it's been 3.5 years since Grenfell Tower, since the horrific fire, which I'm sure that all the listeners will absolutely remember. It's still sort of scarred in my memory. It was just hugely upsetting. Why has it taken so long? Why has it taken 3.5 years to remove all the flammable cladding? And how many people are still living in properties that are essentially or could be dangerous to live in?
So the issue really has been that the government tried to sort of sweep this under the carpet, and not much was done in the first couple of years really. So then we had gradually things have come out. So we had ACM cladding at first, which was the type of cladding that was on Grenfell. And since then, other cladding's been tested. So there was HPL cladding, which is on a lot of buildings, which has kind of caused the biggest problem. I think it is not quite as flammable as ACM, but still dangerous for those of us living in those buildings. And there's been, the government sort of just delayed really in trying to get any grip on the numbers involved and taking any real action. The first action that we really saw was the ACM fund, which was relatively small. We then had some additional money March last year for non-ACM buildings. Which only covered a really quite small fraction. It's 1.6 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but it only covers sort of a really small percentage of the problem. And the focus has just not been on collecting data, not been on finding out how many of these buildings are unsafe. So until you know the size of the problem, you can't really offer a kind of genuine solution to it, really. So at this stage, we still don't really have a clear idea of numbers, but potentially up to 11 million people are affected by this scandal. one way or another, either because they're living in homes that are unsafe or because they're unable to get EWS forms to say that their homes are safe. But there are probably around 3,000 buildings that have registered for the fund over 18 metres. So, they're the really the sort of buildings that the government are focusing on, but potentially around 77,000 buildings under 18 metres, which, at the moment we still don't know the status of whether they're safe or unsafe.
I would also just chip in that the government spent 2 years basically saying building owners and developers should do the right thing. They knew what the law is. Leasehold law, which is quite an archaic system, means that we're literally at the bottom of the food chain where a freeholder can do anything they want and then recharge it to us. But the government, successive prime ministers, ministers of housing kept saying building owners, developers do the right thing, protect leaseholders from more costs. That failed completely. So government realised it was failing, so they started giving some money. But as I say, it's been 3.5 years, and they're now taking it seriously because it's all over the press, it's all over the media. MPs from each party are, supporting our cause for fairness. So they're getting there, but they're just spending a lot of time just trying to, playing with the optics of it, talking about the cladding scandal, for example, when we've said for the past year, it's extended far beyond that. So they still don't have as firm a grip, as Tash says, on the data as well. Because once you've got the data, then you can assess the risk. Then you'll know the true extent of the funding problem. It's simply a case of saying, we'll throw money at it. Hopefully the press will calm down now.
I mean, that is such an incredibly large amount of people that could be affected. I didn't realise it could be as many as 11 million, which is, I mean, it's horrifying however many, but that is really quite shocking. And from what I understand from your campaign, it's been sort of shoved over to leaseholders to have to deal with this, as you sort of briefly mentioned there, Giles. So have the people responsible kind of shirked responsibility? How has it ended up in the hands of leaseholders, and what have they had to do to be protecting themselves?
When we first find out that your home's unsafe, you get a letter, you might see two blokes walking around in a high-vis jackets. It's a waking watch, so they can wake you up at night if there's a fire. So you wonder what's happened exactly. So we go to the builders and developers, and they say, "Oh, we received all the approvals at the time." We then go to the building control, the local authority. They say, "Oh no, we just signed the completion certificate. It doesn't prove anything." So we've sort of been going back and forth, and that's now kind of being mirrored between government and the developers. And ultimately, the government regulations have always been weak for about 30 years. The builders have been able to do what they want, and ultimately, again, we're just literally at the bottom of the ladder, just hoping that someone will come in and help us and stand true to the words of protecting us. Because the law basically does mean that we, would be forced to pay, but there's no way we can pay. And ultimately, it's just a question of fairness. There's no way we should pay, really, because our homes have just been built so unsafely, under 80 metres, over 80 metres, inside, outside. That's where we go back to the numbers are quite difficult, because you don't know until you rip apart the walls, when you look between the floors, what exactly is there. Because everyone could just do what they wanted for 20, 30 years.
I mean, you didn't build the place. That's not your fault. It's just ridiculous. But the costs, from what I've seen, the costs are absolutely just bonkers, aren't they? The charges that have been pushed onto leaseholders, it's in sort of hundreds of thousands. Is that right?
Yeah, they're absolutely nuts. And I mean, I think the biggest bill that we're aware of is 160,000 per flat, which is just, that could be the value of someone's property, if not more. These aren't, big fancy, they're 1-2 bedroom flats, all over the country. It isn't just London centred, it's all over the country, up and down, big cities, smaller towns. It's everywhere, and that's just the remediation costs. That's before we even get into interim measures. So whilst obviously these are really big projects, they're not something that can be done overnight. As an example, our project is anticipated to take 18 months to 2 years to complete. So it's until you've got the cladding off, the building is still unsafe. So we're having to pay increased insurance charges. Sometimes insurance has gone up by 1,000% for a building, which means that some flats are paying £3,000 a year just on insurance for their building. That's per flat, which is just nuts. People don't have that sort of money. People living in these homes don't have that money just lying around. Then we've got waking watches. I think the worst figure that we've heard on Waking Watches is £1,500 a month per flat, which again, that's someone's income, that gone just on having some chap wandering around in a high-vis jacket, looking out for a fire, basically. And that can be there until the fire alarm is installed, which again is another cost that's passed on to leaseholders, or even after the fire alarms are installed. So it's just, the remediation cost is the biggest number, but until then, people are still paying huge amounts of money just for the interim measures. And we all heard, I know, Tony, you covered the cladding scandal before, and the case of Hayley Tillotson, who went bankrupt just because of interim measures. She hadn't even had the remediation costs yet, and we fear that actually that will be the position for a lot of people because they can't maintain these amounts of money for any period of time.
It's really upsetting. And I mean, that's financial anxiety. You must also have anxiety about living in a place that you don't know how safe you are in it. What does that feel like? Is that it must be causing a lot of mental health issues for people?
Yeah, the mental health toll, I have to say, is really quite significant. I can speak on this from a personal perspective, but also from someone who's supporting people in the building, and as a sort of wider campaign group. It's awful to know that your home's unsafe, and there's when we first heard, I was thinking about how long will it take me to get down my 12 flights of stairs? Will I get out in time? What would I have to, is there anything that I should have by the door to be able to take with me in the event of a fire? Because will I be able to get out quick enough? It's really quite terrifying. And then you think, you've got the Waking Watch in place. Will they come back into the building to knock on people's doors? And people are, it's the pressure of the situation from a financial perspective, but also from just feeling unsafe in your homes, especially when we're locked down in them, 23 hours a day. We sometimes feel that actually we would be safer outside than inside because our homes are so unsafe. And many of us don't know the scale of the problem until we start taking the cladding off.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to that, really. I think the point is that you are locked down in your home and, you start off with the financial, insecurity and then, just either getting a bill and saying your home might be safe, it might not be safe, we need to do some checks. But like Tash says, I live on the 9th floor and I've got fire alarms installed now in my flats, all the flats in the development that open out to the unsuitable construction. We've actually got the same cladding as a Grenfell tragedy, which still hasn't come off yet. We're hopeful it'll be in the next couple of months, but we just don't know. So every so often I'll hear someone beeping outside, or you'll hear something, you think, is that my alarm going off? Is that someone else's alarm going off? And you're just constantly in a state of sort of being on edge. And you sort of get used to it after a while, really. When you're just lying down, you just think about cladding and then just thinking, hang on a minute, it's now like 10:30. What we've been thinking for the past half hour. So the mental health impacts, you can't really underestimate them, to be honest, because it is, especially in a pandemic where it's just, am I safer at home? Am I safer outside? I'm safer at home, safer outside. So yeah, it's constant, financial, mental, just everything. You just feel trapped, really.
It's just awful. I'm so sorry that you have to go through that. It's so horrible that, I think it was Theresa May, wasn't it, that when she said, we'll make sure this never ever happens again, no one go through it. And it's sort of 3.5 years later, haven't done a thing.
That's a really frustrating thing, that it's always the politicians, the Grenfell tragedy, the anniversary, it's never again. They're on Twitter, never again, hashtag never again. And that's the thing, they're just all these warm words for years. They'll protect us, then sell it from unaffordable costs. And it's just, you just get more and more angry. And so, they don't realize they're actually helping us by helping us campaign in a weird way. But the fact is that they just keep saying these trite words that don't mean anything. They never back them up with action. And it's made us all very cynical and even more angry. So it's good in a way, but it's also, we just need to see a final, a one-stop solution that just means we can all get on with our lives. Because honestly, it could just carry on another 5-10 years, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't give them any incentive to think it's good in any way. They'll take that and run with it. Well, we've boosted some people's confidence or something. There'll be a way to spin it. You sort of mentioned, obviously, there's a lot of people that are responsible for this in terms of the construction of the buildings, but then there's in terms of the policies and things. Who would you say should be responsible for it now? And have there been any attempts from anyone to be accountable for it and take control of the situation?
Where should we start? So it's been a problem for decades, and it's successive governments. And we always want to make that point that it's not just the Conservatives, not just Labour, it's not just coalition government. In 2006, they were concerned about climate change, which meant that they allowed combustible insulation to be put into flats because they were worried about energy efficiency. So it's successive governments. The point that we always say, and we have been saying for 2 years, is it's only government that's got the power to put the money up front and actually take on the claims against the developers. Because there's this constant, as I say, when we discovered it, we go between the builders and the building control. Now we're going back and forth between government, and it's just pillar to post again. Ultimately, the regulations, they were inadequate and impossible to use and allowed the gaming of the system, this horrible term called value engineering, where they could just, save a lot of costs by cutting important safety corners. No one ever looked over it. There was no oversight. So it's government regulations, but it is the bad builder practice. And then we start looking at some of the product manufacturers who've just been faking their fire safety tests for decades. Some of the revelations from the Grenfell, it's every day you just see something else. But no one's going after those manufacturers, are they? Why isn't the government actually just almost taking on those claims? They've started doing a little bit by saying we're going to levy the developers over 10 years for 2 billion, but it's a drop in the ocean. It's not even going to scratch the surface. It means we're going to have to pay the rest of it through either loans or, a lot of people are just going to move to forfeiture and repossession, really, because there's just going to be no point. No.
What was because the Building Safety Fund was announced last May, and we'll get to the more recent announcement in a minute, but what were the problems with that? Was that because, as far as I understood, it just wasn't anywhere near enough money to cover the things that were needed? Is that right?
Yeah, there was a couple of problems with it. First, not enough money. It's 1.6 billion or 1 billion for HPL cladding, and the extra 600,000 was previously announced for ACM cladding. There were problems with it from the start. So 1 billion, again, sounds like a lot of money, but in the grand scale of this crisis, it just isn't. And it was restricted to, so it's done on a first come first served basis, which just seems like the most bizarre way to operate something that is making people's homes safe. You get there first and you get the first lot of money, regardless of whether your home is, on the scale of unsafe. There might be some that are much worse off than you. So that was a problem. It only covered cladding or cladding systems, as they called it. So there are lots of things which it's now, as applications have gone in and have been assessed by the government, lots of things that are coming out that they're not covering. So you might have combustible insulation, for example, but they're not, and they'll cover that if it's behind cladding. But if it's behind brick, you're going to have a problem claiming that back. So these people are getting sort of partial funding, but that partial funding might cover, say, half the problem, but they still have to raise the other half from leaseholders. And, cutting a bill in half is great, but if the bill is 70,000, cutting it in half still doesn't make it affordable for anybody. It was also limited to buildings over 18 metres only. So anyone in a building under 18 metres just hasn't, they don't even have a chance at that funding. There was a kind of a concession by the government, I suppose, that buildings that were over 17.7 metres could apply. They basically, it became clear that the builders were sort of playing the system because the regulations were less stringent for buildings under 18 metres. So they were building them deliberately just under 18 metres to get around that, which, that there was. So if your building was over 17.7 metres, you could apply for funding. But, that still excludes a large proportion of these issues and also these buildings. So it just isn't enough.
I mean, the fact that if you're in a building that's less than 18 metres, is there sort of thinking that, well, I suppose you can get out easier and still lose everything you've ever had? Like, there's no sense to that at all.
So Robert Jemrick in his statement said that he would be focusing the new Building Safety Fund and the previous chunk of money on buildings over 18 metres where the risk was higher, or highest, I think he said. But there is actually no, we haven't seen evidence that that's the sort of a cut-off at which it becomes much more dangerous. And actually, a senior civil servant was recorded saying that they were using the 18-metre height limit because they didn't have time to come up with a better number. There's video footage of that out there. And, you know, that's quite a shocking approach to take to building safety and what is essentially risking people's lives. And the fact that the government haven't moved away from this 18-metre height limit is, you know, it's awful, absolutely disgusting in my view.
Yeah, that video's on YouTube, and we've seen it a couple of times before, and it hasn't really got the sort of attention. But now I think it's in the newspaper, Inside Housing again. Pete Apps reported on it, and it's quite shocking. It was after Grenfell, and it's the guy. I mean, I won't say his name, but you can probably link the YouTube, or you can find out yourself. And he's responsible for the building regulations. But it's literally just the strangest. It looks like a comedy show or something. It's like satire, because it's so flippant, his responses, just saying, oh, I don't know, you know, something to do with heights and ladders, something like that. You've got people laughing in the background. Well, now our lives are being judged by this. We're potentially going to be pushed into loan schemes for centuries because they haven't yet got a handle on risk. So it just sort of, you know, it shows the attitude, really, of whether it's government, of whether it's the civil servants, of just, okay, you know, like I think you mentioned in your last podcast, you know, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. That's not really the way to deal with safety and risk at our buildings and making, you know, the voters, the people who are going to vote you in next time.
You sort of mentioned earlier that obviously they're only aiming to sort of deal with cladding because it's in the news and people aren't paying attention to the fact these buildings are unsafe in many other ways. And so it doesn't seem like they're bothered about the ones that we don't all know about.
When we relaunched our End Our Cladding Scandal campaign. We initially started in April 2019 because the focus was on aluminium composite material, which was the cladding. Even then, though, we said that we need a building safety fund, all heights, all defects. So when we relaunched in September, that was one of the key things. We even said in our step 2, it's not just cladding. That's what we've been saying. It's the cladding systems, it's inside, it's timber balconies. At my building, they didn't even apply any fire protection to the steel framework. So that means, you know, if there's a fire, the building potentially will collapse quite quickly. I mean, that's just a very simple way of saving money. So it goes far beyond cladding, and this is where, you know, the ministers, the government's sort of playing with the optics. You know, I think they said a couple of times, "Oh, we're ending the cladding scandal." Well, you're not ending the building safety crisis. You know, we are still going to be trapped. We're still going to have to pay tens of thousands of pounds. Just to pick up on that point about they've said historically used 18 meters as, you know, the cut off. Over that, it's more difficult potentially to escape. So we've always said, is 18 meters, you know, there's a lot of different things that make up assessing risk. Robert Jenrick himself, and this really winds me up, 20th of January 2020, he did say he's commissioning leading experts in the field to develop a sophisticated assessment of risk. We're still waiting for that because he said himself, height is a crude and arbitrary factor. So, okay, height's a crude and arbitrary factor 13 months ago. If you issued a call for evidence that closed in May 2020, where the results of that 12 times in his statement, which we might well come on to. Sorry, I've got into a bit of diatribe here. 12 times he said he'll rely on expert advice. No one's seen that expert advice. Where is it?
I was just going to ask you about his statement because that was the big announcement last week, or the other week, you know, and I wondered if that made any positive improvements at all, if that sort of update was what listeners can't see is that Giles raised his eyebrows in the most amazing way.
I've been told I need to control my eyebrows.
No, that was brilliant. I like that. Yeah, I wish that listeners would be able to see your eyebrows answered the question very quickly. Yeah, so I'm guessing from that expression that it wasn't a positive announcement at all.
I relaunch into my diatribe again. Again, it goes back to the fact that we do welcome the more money, and that's the thing. In total, it'll be 5 billion, although 2 billion of that, as far as we understand, will be repaid off by the levy system. So it's still a sizable amount of money to the general public. You know, it's why are you giving these guys 3 billion or 5 billion, whatever it may be. Ultimately, though, it's still not going to fix the problem, and it's still not a proper holistic approach to say. And like they did this in Australia, so they've not even learned from the task force. They've spoken to the guys over there. It's not a simple case, but you've got 3,000 buildings. You can at least start to say which are the highest risk that we need to focus on, which are medium risk, which are the lowest risk, which we might not have to do anything to. But it needs to be a solution for all buildings. There's a lot of buildings. I spoke to a lady, 76-year-old lady in Disbury the other day. It lives in a 3-story building and is being told that she can't sell it, she can't do anything with it because she needs to get an EWS1 form. They said it might be 2 or 3 years. So it just needs to be all buildings to say, especially the ones that are deemed lower to medium risk, can you be moved out of this process? Can you have, say, sprinklers, alarms, etc.? So it's not that proper holistic approach, because they're just saying, here's more money. Hopefully the public will now think we've ended it. Hopefully these guys will go away. We're not going away. We're not quite back to square one, but we do still need a proper approach. We just need to be able to say the certainty is going to return to the market, because Generic, Boris, Rishi, they're all hopeful that the mortgage providers, the insurers, the valuation agents will just say, oh, okay, we'll just move on with our lives. Whereas they're going to keep carrying on covering their backsides and minimising their liability until government provides that certainty. Sorry, I could keep going on for another hour or so, but...
No, it's great. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask about, because you sort of read through your list of aims, your campaign aims, and one of them is that social housing providers have as much access to the fund. Is that something that hasn't happened with the previous two announcements? Have social housing providers kind of been left out of it a bit?
Yeah, the position for social housing is a bit odd. So they weren't originally, when the Building Safety Fund was announced last year, they weren't going to be included at all. The government had taken a decision that actually they didn't need to. They had enough money to pay. But the reality is that for leaseholders in social housing, they can pass on the costs in the same way that private housing can. So you are still a leaseholder, and it can hit particularly hard for shared owners. So this sort of affordable housing scheme backed by the government, you buy a percentage of your home, and you might own, say, 25% of that property, but still be liable for 100% of the costs. So you're essentially paying for the housing association to fix the housing association's proportion of your property, which you still pay rent on. Which is just an absolutely bizarre system to me. The other thing is that their social housing providers are only able to claim for the amount that would otherwise be passed on to leaseholders, except in really sort of exceptional circumstances where they can show that they simply can't afford to pay. But for those, yes, social housing providers, they have a pot of money, but the question is, how should that money be best spent? Should it be spent on fixing these homes, or should it be spent on providing more affordable housing, which I think we all agree that we need. So the more money they're putting into fire safety issues, the less they're spending on actually helping the housing market and doing all of the sort of good things that social housing should be doing. So yeah, we think that social housing providers should have exactly the same access, which they don't currently have. And that wasn't changed by Robert Jenrick's announcement last week.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that the MPs are cottoning onto this, MPs are speaking out about it. And I know there's sort of quite a lot of cross-party support to deal with not just the cladding but other issues, and obviously the Grenfell inquiry is happening as well, endlessly, that's highlighting more and more problems. But what can be done to directly put pressure on the government to fix this? Obviously you're doing a lot of work with your campaign. What else should be done? What else should be highlighted? What can we all do?
Well, I think the first thing is writing to MPs. They still think, many of them still think that this is, a London or big city centred issue, but that isn't true. We're getting people with two-story buildings being asked for EWS1s. So it really isn't a big issue. And the reality is that, if you've got a housing market where the bottom rung is completely broken, the effect on the economy, the wider housing market and the economy, is going to be huge. At the moment there was I think this sort of stamp duty break has really been sort of pushing up holding up the housing market for the moment. But as soon as that ends, what's going to happen? The reality is that none of these flats are being bought and sold. And the other end of things is that, if you've got lots of people that are quite literally going bankrupt because they can't afford their homes, what's that going to do to the economy at a time when we really don't need any other issues? So writing to your MP, even if you're not directly affected, just to say how important this issue is, and how unfair it is, I think that helps. We've got our petition, which we'd really encourage anybody that feels, that sympathises with our position to sign, because, it's all about creating more media attention, and that's what's got us, until all of this, until we had a lot of media attention, we weren't really getting any response from government. But Robert Jenrick's announcement kind of came, we think, as a response to public pressure, really. And everyone, it seems, is in agreement that this is so unfair. So yeah, signing the petition, following our campaign, and just supporting, all of the things that we're doing, really, would, anyone that feels strongly we'd really appreciate that.
There's just one thing as well, just to mention that, as Tash sort of touched upon, that we've now got, there's politics at play here in sort of a good way and a bad way, because the Labour MPs, Labour are now really all over it. Keir Starmer's really come out strongly. Prior to that, or recently this year, there's a fire safety bill going through the House of Parliament. It's back in the House of Commons. So first, we all give a shout out to Baroness Kath Pinnock in the House of Lords, who actually tabled the amendment to say, hang on a minute, we need to protect leaseholders. That's come back to the House of Commons, and there it's both the Lib Dems, Daisy Cooper's been very strong about it, and the Conservatives, Stephen McPartland and Royston Smith. So we've got a lot of Conservatives, and as we say, right to MPs, but it's the Conservatives we really want to try and focus on, because ultimately this just very simply comes down to talking about home ownership and fairness. And that's what the Conservatives say are their key brands and key messages. So they are coming out in support. Some of them are still towing the party line a bit, but more and more can see the absolute unfairness of this. And this was partly why Robert Jenrick's statement came out last week, or on the 10th, because we were expecting it to come out a little later and close to the budget. But the fire safety bill is actually returning to the House of Commons this week. So it's partly to quell the Tory rebellion. But as you can see, it's not really worked. 5 or 6 MPs have withdrawn their support, but there's still 30 plus. So keep writing Conservative MPs, keep talking about home ownership, fairness, and the fact that government has said for years that building owners, developers should do the right thing. Well, government needs to do the right thing now.
And you mentioned your petition earlier. Can you just tell me a bit about that?
So the petition is essentially to stop these costs being passed on to leaseholders. The idea, we're sort of we want to get as much support and show that actually it isn't just those in these homes that are affected. We're all, there's a way to stand up for fairness, really, in all of this, and it isn't just us that's saying that this is unfair. It really is a kind of everybody getting behind it and realizing that actually this could have such wide consequences, that it shouldn't just matter to those people that are caught up in it, but also just a general, do we want to live in a society where people are still living in unsafe homes because the government won't take any action? Whether I lived in an unsafe home myself or not, I wouldn't. That's that. Our petition is a 38 degrees petition, and we'll share the link with you, Tiernan.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think it is one of those things that, when Grenfell happened, it was so awful, and we all just thought this must never ever happen again. And suddenly it's 3.5 years later. And I think it's in everyone's minds of going, we can't believe this is, regardless of your politics, you should be thinking the last thing the government should be wanting to happen is to leave people in unsafe homes and make them pay for the privilege of wanting to be safe. It's completely bonkers. But best of luck with it. And the last question I just want to ask you is something that I ask every guest on the show, which is simply, apart from yourself, and your campaign, is there anyone else that you'd recommend that listeners follow or read up on, or websites to go to that are specifically, either about safety regulations and your the campaign, or to do with housing and issues like that in general? Who are your go-to people?
Well, Inside Housing, specifically Pete Apps and Jack Simpson, have been covering this story for a long time, and their coverage is just incredible. Their knowledge on the subject is amazing. Well worth looking at them. Sunday Times and the Daily Mail have also been doing campaigns. Martina Lees has written some really in-depth articles looking at this issue. And Miles Dilworth for the Daily Mail has been covering on a regular basis as well. So they're sort of key go-tos. And also there's a lot of commentators on Twitter, legal commentators, Giles Peaker, Justin Bates, and Sue Bright, that are really covering the legal side of this, which is a big part of the problem we're facing. So there's a lot of really good resources out there.
I would also say, Tasha's pretty much covered more. I think 2 years ago, in April 2019, it was a few leaseholders from Sheffield, Manchester and London just went to Inside Housing and said, what can we do about this? And Martin Hilditch as well, the editor of Inside Housing, very supportive. And that's where, we've snowballed from there, really. So, we started off with a handful of leaseholders, now thousands of people in different regions. So I'll just go back to, Martina Lee's definitely has been covering this from sort of day one. Pete Apps is my boy, Pete Apps, I can't say highly enough about him, really. He doesn't like my voice notes, but, he'll get used to them.